Hi, Jess.
Hey,
How are you?
um, I'm doing fine. I want to throw my computer out the window. Um, I don't know why, but I'm still popping up as basic, so I'm going to have to call IT.
Oh, really? Okay. So
So I
you're not a
probably,
co-host?
it doesn't seem like anything from, uh, I do not think so. No, I'm not.
I think I
Oh,
just made you one.
okay. I saw that popped up.
So yeah, if I just have to do it manually every meeting, that's not a big deal.
Well, I'll see from my end. I'll call IT again and we'll see what's going
It doesn't
on.
make any sense. I mean, you joined several meetings last semester, so I don't know why it would be any different.
Well, I mean, it was the way that I was joining because I do have a personal account.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
it's not like connecting, so they're
Okay.
going to have to do something on their end. And just a quick question. So I'm the co-host, and I've never allowed people to come in. Okay, never mind. Just figure it out.
Yeah. So you can see the waiting room here on the left, on the right.
Now,
Yeah,
yeah.
just click admit as students come in, just click admit for them.
Okay. All right.
And then what my other TAs, we just finished my O1 meeting, um, which worked out great. I ended up having almost 100 people show up. Um,
Great.
yeah, and so my TAs in there just sort of took notes on my lecture, the points that I cover, because that'll help. I'm really trying to cover specific things that are mentioned in the quiz. So that'll
Okay.
help you with all quiz questions that they come to you with.
Well, and I'm creating because if I would like to TA for you next semester too. I don't know what, I
Great.
mean, I don't know if you've heard anything, if you're going to continue to do online or you're wanting to get back uh, into the classroom. But I'm creating something that in the event next semester, it'll be really easy, much
Okay.
easier for me. And I do feel like it's going to be easier. Just this first half, I'm not quite sure
Right.
exactly what you're looking at, but looking for, excuse me. So,
Yeah, it will
um,
be. And yeah, I'm supposed to be sort of half and half face to face and online. So depending on which onlines I get, I'll definitely request you to be
yeah, same.
my TA again. Did you do O1? I can't remember. Were you O1 or O2 last semester? You were
I
O2,
was
right?
O2.
Okay.
Yeah,
So maybe you
O2.
want to stick with that?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be fine. I could do both. I like I like to hear the material over and over again because it
Okay.
keeps me present in the time period that I'm studying, which is, post Civil War. So, but I
Okay.
can do either one. It's, I'm
Sounds good.
fine.
Awesome. Okay, let me just figure out where this recording's going to go and then we'll get started.
Sure.
All right. Not as much of a turnout, but welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. First of all, this is Jess, our TA. She's going to be grading several of y'all's papers, and she'll be your first point of contact for some stuff. Um, okay, so to start with, let's go over some policies and procedures that we've covered pretty thoroughly throughout the first week. But a few things that I want to reiterate. Make sure you guys read the announcement on question types, what we expect from short answer questions. We want to see a substantial paragraph for each of these short answer responses. This is your chance to really prove what you've learned, to really prove to us that you read and understood the chapter. So make sure that you use complete sentences. You give us several sentences and a substantial paragraph that shows us you understand the content. Plagiarism, gotta hammer this home again. It's very easy to catch plagiarism, and it's a big deal at the university level. Do not take any more than 3 consecutive words from another source without giving credit to the original source. You can use direct quotations if you're citing the book, but we really want you to read the chapter, internalize the information, and answer all questions in 100% your own words. So plagiarism does apply to the book as well. We don't want to see you copy word for word out of the book. That's still considered plagiarism. So make sure all answers are 100% in your own words. The fill in the blank questions should be pretty easy. If you see a bracketed letter, that's where you need to fill in a word or phrase that completes the statement. One issue we run into with those is students emailing us, oh, I got this question right, but it marked it wrong. That's because Blackboard wants an exact match to what I wrote as the correct response. This means if you capitalize something or you had incorrect spelling or punctuation, it'll be counted as incorrect initially. But don't worry, Jess and I go through every assignment and make sure that everything is accurately graded. You'll get full credit for misspelling a word or wrong punctuation or capitalization in your fill in the blank answers. So don't worry about those. If you got the answer right but misspelled it, it'll eventually be counted right as we go through each of those assignments. What else? The Respondus lockdown browser. Make sure everybody knows how to use the Respondus lockdown browser. There's a tutorial up and a little video of how to download it and use it. You'll only need to use it for your midterm and your final, but you'll have to be able to use it. So make sure you guys understand that and how it works now so that we don't run into any problems when we get to our exams. There was an issue with Chromebooks and the lockdown browser, but I was told that that issue's been resolved. Either way, try it on your laptop or tablet soon so that you know if it works or not, so that we can try to tackle any issues you might run into. All right. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on policies and procedures? Anything about the syllabus?
Professor, I do have just one quick question.
Okay.
Do you care about what format we cite in, like MLA, APA, all that stuff? What would you prefer?
You'll use very few citations in this class. You will be writing essays, but we won't expect you to use, we're historians, we use Turabian format or Chicago style. But you won't be writing any big papers outside of class where you'll need to cite stuff. If we do a citation or a source assignment, I'll put up a posting showing you how to use Chicago style.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. What else, guys? Any questions? All right. Well, let's get into some content then. So this first week's assignment is pretty easy, pretty short compared to most weeks. I want to sort of ease you guys into the process, ease you guys into the semester. So don't expect all of our assignments to be this short. We will expect a little more critical thinking, a little more original analysis in future assignments. But this first one's just to sort of get your feet wet. So make sure you guys all read. Hopefully you've already all read chapter 15 and taken extensive notes on Reconstruction. That combined with this to help supplement your reading in your notes should prepare you guys to get an A on every chapter assignment. All right, so we're talking about Reconstruction today. There's really 2 phases of Reconstruction that we need to get into. Presidential Reconstruction, which was a failed attempt at reconstructing the South, and then what is often known as Republican or Radical Reconstruction. So hopefully you guys have all taken 1301. You learned about the Civil War. The root cause of the Civil War is indisputably the institution of slavery. The war was fought over slavery and the federal government's authority to affect or to implement or restrict the institution of slavery across the South, across the Midwest, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise, both being two early indicators of limitations to the federal government's ability to impact slavery. So now we're going to talk about the era after the Civil War and the process of bringing the South, which seceded from the Union, back into the United States. So the chapter begins talking about some of the first efforts to help facilitate assimilation of African Americans into mainstream American culture. One of the first attempts starts even before the Civil War is officially ended, with Sherman in the South redistributing land, which often comes to be known as Sherman Land. This is where you hear the saying 40 acres and a mule. That's because Sherman, who was a general in the Union Army, meets with a group of Black delegates in South Carolina, and they express their concerns to Sherman about this process of competing openly in an economic society, integrated society, with whites who have dominated land distribution and the economic process in the South prior to the Civil War. So the Sherman Land is designed to give African Americans access to upward social mobility. This is an important term, upward social mobility. It's this idea that you can get an education, that you can get training in a specific industry, you can get marketable skills to work your way up the socioeconomic ladder, to improve your standing in American society. This is basically what this sort of notion of the American dream is based on, right? Well, the federal government needs to become actively involved in promoting and making available access to this social mobility for African Americans who were marginalized and commodified prior to the Civil War in the South. They were considered property rather than humans. They were dehumanized and commodified under laws in the South, eventually culminating with the Dred Scott case, that basically stripped them of their natural rights, right? Which is very much what the Constitution is constructed around, this idea of inalienable or natural rights. So this process of reconstructing the South is bringing African Americans into mainstream society, economics, education, culture, and allowing them access to upward social mobility. Well, the majority of politicians, especially Republicans, both moderate and radical Republicans, know that the South won't facilitate this process on their own. The South seceded from the Union based on this notion that African Americans are inherently inferior and they should be able to enslave African Americans. We also learned in 1301 that in April of '65, Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, leaving his vice president, a man named Andrew Johnson, to assume the presidency. In '64, Lincoln asked Johnson to be his VP, or Republicans asked Johnson to run as VP, because they wanted to extend their influence into the South. The writing was on the wall that the South the Confederate Army wasn't going to win the war, that the Union would prevail. And they hoped that Lincoln with Johnson would have more of an influence on the South if they brought a Southerner, Johnson, into the executive branch. So Johnson is a Southern Democrat who's really a unionist at heart. He really wants to preserve the Union, but he's also a racist. He believes these same ideas that many of these Southern planter class believes in the inherent inferiority of African Americans. He believes that basically African Americans shouldn't be involved in the Reconstruction process, that the Reconstruction process should be facilitated by powerful whites in the South. So Johnson's the wrong guy to facilitate Reconstruction. When Lincoln dies in '65 and Johnson takes over, he immediately begins to try to break down systems which help African Americans achieve this upward social mobility. Another one of the early important institutions to facilitate Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is run by a man named O.O. Howard. Sees the establishment of this bureau, which is designed to help African Americans access education, not only African Americans, also poor white Southerners, education, healthcare. They're involved in land redistribution. They're involved in facilitating Sherman lands. They control hospitals. And like I said, they help poor Southern whites. And we also have this division in the South between the common folk and the planter class, right? Where the planter class are really the ones that facilitated secession and facilitated the Civil War, but they really don't represent the majority of Southerners who are poor white farmers who couldn't afford to own slaves in the first place. So many of those Union loyalists also fall under the purview of the Freedmen's Bureau. Another big task of the Freedmen's Bureau is to facilitate this land redistribution. This will be one of the first times where Johnson really sort of distinguishes himself from Republicans who support redistributing land to Blacks in the South. Johnson, however, believes that these lands should go back to the landholders that owned them prior to the Civil War. Well, those landowners were enemies of the United States. Right? They were members of the Confederate Army, which went to war against the Union, went to war against the United States. So most Republicans at the time, it should be mentioned, by the way, that Republican and Democratic dynamics in the 19th century have no relation to contemporary Republican and Democratic dynamics, just so you guys know. But Republicans in the 19th century believed that in order for African Americans to achieve upward social mobility, they had to own land so that they could have agency in the economic process, so that they can control the economic process. Johnson and Southern elites, the planter class, believed that those lands should go back to these Confederate traders who seceded from the Union and were the enemies of the United States. So this is the first time he butts heads with Republicans and says, no, I think those lands should go back to the planter class, whereas Sherman, Republicans, these what will come to be known as radical Republicans, believe it should be redistributed to Black farmers. So that land redistribution becomes one of the major sort of turning points or these sticking points in early Reconstruction efforts. This is when Republicans really start to realize that Johnson isn't interested in truly reconstructing the South. He's interested in reforming the South into what it was prior to the Civil War, where white planter class slave owners own the majority of land and control the economic and political processes in the South. Okay? So Johnson mentioned several times that he publicly speaks ill of African Americans, say they aren't capable of being part of the Reconstruction process. And this basically forces African Americans into a system known as sharecropping. This is an important point, where African Americans, often former slaves, are forced to work on land that is owned by former slave or plantation owners that they then lease to African Americans for a share of their crop. They take such an exorbitant share of their crop every season that these African Americans can never make enough money to buy their own land. This is another way to circumvent slavery and basically force or relegate African Americans again into a marginalized economic system where they can't compete openly with whites. So in many ways, this is another form of slavery. This is a way to make sure that they keep African Americans down, keep them marginalized so that they cannot compete openly in economic systems with larger plantation owners. We also start to see the adoption of what are known as Black codes in the South. During this era of presidential Reconstruction, which is really fake Reconstruction, which is really a process of returning to the systems and the returning to the conditions of the antebellum South, we see that leaving the states to create their own constitutions and write their own laws leads state legislatures dominated by white people to instill black codes, which are basically laws to discriminate against African Americans. They're often designed to disenfranchise or to make sure African Americans can't be involved in local voting processes. They don't have access to education. They can't compete openly in business and economic enterprises, etc. So these black codes are proof that if you leave the South to reconstruct itself, it's only going to reform itself to conditions prior to the Civil War, where white Anglo-Protestant men dominate the power hierarchies in the South. So because of this position, Johnson's becoming increasingly disliked in the Republican Party. The Republicans at the time are kind of split between these moderate Republicans and radical Republicans. Radical Republicans want the federal government to be directly involved in reconstructing the South. Moderate Republicans are sort of on the fence. Keep in mind, this is right after the Civil War, and a lot of politicians' main motivation is to preserve the Union. So they see that these radical Reconstruction ideas might lead to further Southern secession. So a lot of these moderates are using this fear over the recent Civil War to take a more moderate approach to Reconstruction. Then you have Southern Democrats who don't want any Reconstruction process at all. So from 65 to 66 to 67, Johnson is becoming increasingly unpopular with Republicans. Johnson then starts to pardon Confederate sympathizers and Confederate officers that were in direct conflict with the US military, with the Union Army. He starts to take away Sherman land from black farmers and give it back to former Confederate sympathizers. Keep in mind, he's from North Carolina. He's a Southerner. He's a Southern Democrat at heart. So this really makes the passage of these black codes, the land redistribution, this really drives a wedge between Johnson and other Union politicians, especially these more radical Republicans. Alec, did you have a question? Oh, no, you just...
Yeah, I was wondering about the Republican and Democrat parties. You know what I mean? It seems that they switch roles, into the present. And basically, I was wondering what caused that to happen.
So that's a very complicated question, and we'll get into that. We're going to see that at the end of Reconstruction, after the Compromise of 77, we have a period of Jim Crow laws and a period of oppression in the South, which sparks the African-American civil rights movement of the late 19th and mid 20th century, which is all about challenging the authority of states to enact these laws that are discriminatory against African Americans. So it's a really 100-year process from the end of the Civil War through the end of the Civil Rights era, 64, 65, 68. And it's really Johnson in 64 that switches the Democrats to support civil rights legislation. It actually starts with Hubert Humphrey, and then JFK is a little bit too scared to challenge Southern Democrats, and then Johnson comes in and finally passes the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68. And really from then on, we see Democrats as being the sort of champions of civil rights, so on and so forth. Part of the process is also FDR in 32, redefining the concept of liberalism. That's a great question, Alec. It's just a huge question that goes through a lot of different administrations and a long, long process, but we'll talk about it throughout the semester. Thanks for the question. All right, so we really see this division between moderate and radical Republicans. After Johnson's 2 years of policies oppressing African Americans through 65 and 66, the radical Republicans finally present the Civil Rights Bill of 66. Under the Civil Rights Bill of 66, it will expand rights to African Americans, give them contractual rights, able to write their own contracts, labor rights, able to own property, sought to end black codes, It didn't say anything specifically about African-American enfranchisement, however. They did want to make it known that if the South were to set voting laws that oppressed African-American voting, that they would lose representation in the House. So enfranchisement means your right to vote, okay? So Johnson then comes out as this big proponent of states' rights. He says the federal government shouldn't be involved in manipulating or in writing state constitutions. The federal government shouldn't be involved in individual states and how they set their laws based on or in regards to voting processes and so forth. So this is really where he makes a stand as a states' rights Democrat, which was often an excuse in the 1840s and 50s, really starting with Stephen Douglas, to be a pro-slavery Democrat and hide behind this idea of states' rights. Not everybody used it that way, but certainly was used as a justification for limited federal interaction in how state constitutions were formed. So the bill passes in '66 and Johnson tries to kill it. He vetoes it. 2/3 of the House of the Senate need to override Johnson's veto to get it to pass. 2/3 of the Senate does override the veto. Radical Republicans have a significant majority in Congress at this point. And so Johnson, since he lost the veto on the Civil Rights Bill of '66, he's very unpopular for the black codes being spread across the South. He's very unpopular for how poorly he's handled Reconstruction. Decides to go on a promotional tour in the summer of '66. It's called the Swing Around the Circle. And he says he's going to tour around by train and stop city to city promoting his idea of Reconstruction. Johnson's one of these presidents who was a egomaniacal, sort of had a very limited understanding of the way the country viewed him. He had a very fragile temperament. He couldn't accept criticism. He was a very egotistical individual who never thought he was wrong, believed that everybody was always out to get him. Sound familiar? Just kidding. And so he really had a skewed vision of his own reputation in America. And on this Swing Around the Circle, people are heckling Johnson openly yelling at him and ridiculing him. And Johnson is shocked. I mean, he's the president and people have never addressed the president in such a way. He realizes how unpopular he is. He actually asked Ulysses Grant to come on the tour with him, who is wildly popular as the Union general who forced Lee to surrender. So Grant tours around with him, and rather than it helping Johnson's reputation or helping the way Americans feel about Johnson, it made a bunch of Americans realize Ulysses Grant is who we should really be supporting, not Andrew Johnson. So it made Ulysses Grant much more popular and led to him being elected president 2 years later. So on this Swing Around the Circle, Johnson realizes his views are antiquated, and well, maybe he doesn't realize, but America realizes Johnson's views are very antiquated. This then leads to the election of Grant in '68. Prior to that, Johnson goes head-to-head with radical Republicans against the Reconstruction Act of '67. After '66, radical Republicans have the majority of Senate, so they can pass things a lot more easily. So in '67, they present the Reconstruction Act. This will begin a period known as Radical Reconstruction from '67 to '77. So we have presidential Reconstruction from '65 to '67, then Radical Reconstruction from '67 to '77. Johnson tries to veto this bill again. In the Reconstruction Act, the Senate is basically trying to limit the powers of Johnson. They say that Johnson cannot end federal appointments without the Senate's approval, several other small things to try to limit the power of the executive branch. Johnson goes against this and actually fires the Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton. That's pretty esoteric stuff. You don't need to know that. But basically, this is a way to challenge radical Republicans who then respond by impeaching Johnson. He's the first president to ever be impeached. The problem is there's a sort of a radical individual named Benjamin Wade, who, as the temporary or the head of Congress, would have become president since Johnson didn't have a VP. So they actually fall one vote short of impeaching Johnson because they think Benjamin Wade might be even more detrimental to the Union. There's several reasons why. This also goes down to this split between moderate and radical Republicans in the Senate. But basically, he survives impeachment by one vote, leading to the election of '68, where Grant wins pretty handily, although we start to see that because of the failures of presidential reconstruction, a lot of power has been allocated to Southern white plantation owners. So Grant wins the election in '68 and passes the 15th Amendment. So there's 3 important amendments to come out of this era. Okay, everybody write these down. The 13th Amendment is passed during Lincoln's administration. He uses all of his political capital at the end of '64 to get the 13th Amendment passed, which outlaws slavery in the United States, makes slavery illegal in the US. So then, with the end of the Civil War in '65, the passage of the 13th Amendment, Congress and the government is put in a difficult position where they need to define what role African Americans play in America as citizens. They can't vote yet. They have limited authority and contractual law and business dealings and so forth. So then the 14th Amendment, which is passed and finally ratified in July of '68, is really a byproduct of the Reconstruction Act. And it's the first step in sort of defining what an African-American citizen is in the United States. And the 14th Amendment is often referred to as equal protection, right? That the 14th Amendment will provide equal protection for all American citizens. That all of the parameters of the Constitution will be applied to African Americans just like they will to white Americans. So 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, 14th Amendment defines citizenship, and then the 15th Amendment finally, which radical Republicans have been promoting since '65, '66, is finally passed in February of '70 under the Grant administration, which will enfranchise African American men. Okay? So enfranchise again means giving someone the right to vote. So keep in mind, women of any race still won't have the right to vote for another 50 years. But African-American men are enfranchised with the 15th Amendment in 1870. So 13th, 14th, and 15th. Those are the first 3 important amendments we'll talk about in this class. We'll get into the 16th, 17th, and 18th, and 19th when we talk about the progressive and then the populist and progressive eras. All right, so now we're in the Grant administration. We see the Grant administration starts out with this process of defining citizenship. There's a good section in our book called Boundaries of Freedom and Citizenship. Make sure you read that. And it's all about this sort of defining what role the government will have in providing freedoms and citizenship to African Americans. Also, the government's role in defining what or how to define African American citizenship. There's also some good stuff about repercussions of the second or radical Reconstruction. Pushback in the form of the KKK is established in the South as a form of physical intimidation to try to relegate African Americans to second-class citizenry. The Redeemers, it talks about the Redeemers in our book. They're basically a group of white businessmen and politicians who want to redeem the South to what it was prior to the Civil War.
Sir?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to ask you this question when we're on this subject.
Okay, what's up?
So they passed so that Black men or African American men were able to vote. But to clarify, they still did have things like poll taxes and literacy tests and all that stuff.
Well, we're going to get into that. So this is very much about the federal government's authority to regulate voting processes in the South. We're going to see that during radical Reconstruction, the government sets up 5 Southern districts where they have federal authority in those districts to make sure that they're carrying out laws, that they're enfranchising African Americans, that they're adhering to all the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments based on federal authority. It's really after the compromise or the bargain of 1877 that ends federal authority in the South, that ends federal oversight over how state constitutions write their laws, that state constitutions start to individually target African Americans to make sure they can't vote. So you'll have individual constitutions. The South Carolina Constitution writes in that African American, or that all people have to pay, a $2 poll tax to be able to vote. That's targeting African Americans based on a socioeconomic level. They know African Americans are the poorest members of society, so they won't be encouraged to vote if they have to pay a tax. They attack them on literacy levels. They say you have to pass a literacy test to be able to vote. They know that African Americans have not had access to education, so it's going to be more difficult for them to be able to pass a literacy test and able to vote. They pass things like grandfather clauses that say, well, if your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to take a literacy test or pay a poll tax. Well, there's not a single Black person in the South in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s that's grandparents could vote because their grandparents were all slaves. So this was another way to circumvent federal authority to make sure they couldn't vote. The time period we're talking about now, radical Reconstruction, is when the federal government is in the South, making sure that these rules of Reconstruction are being carried out by overseeing states and how they write their constitutions. We see during this period over 2,000 African Americans hold political office across the country, even in the South. Hiram Revels becomes our first African American senator from the South. We don't get another African American senator from the South for 95 years.
69.
Because federal authority in the South leaves and Jim Crow laws take over because the government isn't watching how Southern constitutions are writing their laws. Make no mistake, Texas is involved in that as well. Alec?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Backtracking to when the military districts were formed, that the generals were in charge. Would the generals have more power than the government, state governments have at that point in time?
Depends on what type of power you're talking about, right? So there's still a division of power between federal authority and state power. But this is specifically about how these states are rewriting their constitutions after the Civil War. So they have authority to make sure they're enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But keep in mind, there's going to be several local codes and local laws that still benefit white people over Blacks, right? Cool, good question. Veronica, you feel clear about that now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, so throughout Reconstruction, we see these great advancements in African American education, African American access to upward social mobility, political agency, enfranchisement. I talked about over 2,000 African Americans held political office, even up to the House of Senate, or the Senate chambers, which is, one of the highest levels in American government. And then as the 1870s wear on, we start to see radical Reconstruction lose popularity. One major reason is because it's expensive. Taxes have to be raised so that Reconstruction can be facilitated in the South, so that new schools can be built, so that federal troops can be sent to oversee these processes, right? This is an expansion of the federal government where the government employs thousands and thousands of people who are facilitating radical Reconstruction. Also in the 1870s, a lot of these poor Southern whites realize that Reconstruction isn't really benefiting them. They aren't seeing great access to upward social mobility. So a lot of them start to support Southern Democratic agendas over Northern Republican agendas. So we see that also forces a lot of people to change their opinion about Reconstruction. So Grant wins re-election, and during his second term, he's having a harder and harder time passing these Reconstruction policies. By the time the election of 77 comes about, the Northern Republicans, which are really dominated by moderates by 77, decide to elect Rutherford Hayes. They know Rutherford Hayes is a moderate. He's not a radical. He wants the country to get back to normal. He wants to focus on, international commerce. He wants to focus on expanding political borders, issues that the federal government was sort of focused on prior to the Civil War. He wants to de-emphasize the importance of Reconstruction. In the election of 77, there's no electoral majority, leaving the decision up to the House of Representatives who will become president between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes. Hayes is a very sort of cunning politician and knows that he can get Southern support if he talks about removing federal authority from the South. So he says, listen, if I can get support of the South, who are mainly opposing the Hayes election, then I'll remove federal authorities from the South and allow you to write your own constitutions. So they basically come up with an electoral commission, which is made up of members of the House, members of the Senate, and Supreme Court justices. Republicans have a 1-seat majority in this 15-person commission. So there's 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Well, they're sort of at a stalemate. And Hayes realizes, if I can convince these Southerners that I'm no longer going to impose federal authority in the South, no longer going to impose federal oversight in the South, that they're going to throw their support towards me. And that's exactly what happens. They elect Rutherford Hayes in 77. He immediately dissolves the 5 districts. He also some smaller things. He agrees to make a Southerner postmaster general. He supports the Transcontinental Railroad that'll eventually run through Texas and New Mexico. Supports some Southern economic building. So several sort of concessions to the South for his own political benefit. I mean, this is not in the best interest of the country. This is in the best interest of Rutherford Hayes. So Hayes comes in 77, removes federal authority from the South, and immediately, as Veronica was saying, the South starts to write their own constitutions, which exclude African Americans from the voting process, which institute the other major prong of the Jim Crow laws, social and what we call de facto and de jure segregation, which separates Americans based on race. And we see this process take hold in the South and will be prevalent in the South through the first half of the 20th century, into the 1950s, into the 1960s, where we finally see the formation of the African American Civil Rights Movement, which challenges the authority of state governments in the South to marginalize African Americans through Jim Crow laws, voting laws, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and segregation laws. All right, guys, let me look over my notes, see if there's anything I left out. Make sure you guys understand who carpetbaggers and scalawags are. 2 terms that are covered in your book that basically describe different people in the South that are trying to take advantage of conditions in the South during Reconstruction. Make sure you guys understand the Freedmen's Bureau. There's a great timeline in your book on page 565. Jess, do you have a 6th edition of the book?
I have, no, I think it's 5th, actually.
You have the 5th. Does anybody in here have a 6th? I just want to make sure it's on the same page. On 565 in the 5th edition, there's a timeline just titled Chronology. And it's got a lot of good information in there. It'll sort of clarify this confusing period between presidential and radical Reconstruction and you know, the Civil Rights Bill and everything you need to know, the Reconstruction Act, etc. So yeah, definitely check that out. And then your secondary source for this week, we'll talk about the Grant administration, the swing around the circle, talk about Reconstruction in the South, the violence in New Orleans. So a lot more on Grant and his administration and Johnson and his administration before that. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Any questions?
Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
sir. I have a question.
Yeah, here? Yes.
On the women's right, it says the organization split into 2 different groups. I just wanted to go over like what were the major differences, if you could just elaborate.
So yeah, women's rights at the same time. We're starting to see the formation of some female suffrage groups. Unfortunately, a lot of these Southern female suffrage groups, the God, what's the big one? Not the American Women's Suffrage Association. They often sort of tie their own enfranchisement or compare their own enfranchisement to African American enfranchisement. Many of these Southern groups are actually sort of, or not sort of, but racist in their own regards, and they sort of justify female enfranchisement by saying, well, if blacks can vote, then why can't women vote? So you start to see the advent of radical women on both sides, many of which are, you know, come from this vein of the Seneca Falls Convention in 48, and this idea of women's enfranchisement as an unalienable right, while you have others that are challenging the federal government and saying, well, if blacks can vote, then why can't women vote? So you do start to see a split in these suffrage associations.
The national was also in the South. The National
American Women's Suffrage Association.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're all over. They're all over the
Both of
place. They're
them?
the biggest one up into the turn of the century, and then the National Women's Party pops up just prior to World War I. That's where we see Lucy Burns and Alice Stokes Paul and these more progressive women that are really the ones that are the champions of the true women's suffrage movement.
Yes, Stanton.
I will give you guys a hint though. Your quiz this week doesn't talk about women radicals, but that's a good section to read, definitely. And make sure you guys understand who the KKK and the Redeemers are. This sort of split between moderate and radical Republicans is important in the 1870s. Jess, you've seen the quiz. Did you see anything I didn't cover that needs to be talked about?
You covered everything. Yeah, you covered everything.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple minutes for more questions. I have to end by 11:50 so that it can download before my next meeting. So any questions about the class, policies, content, quizzes? Okay. Any final comments from you, Jess?
No, none for me.
All right, guys. Well, thanks very much. Good luck on your assignments this week, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. The quizzes due at 5 on Friday. All right.
Okay. All right.
It went pretty well.
Yeah, definitely. You
What do you
covered
think of that?
everything.
What do you think of the
What's
way I set that up? Just sort of lecturing for 45 minutes or so on everything in the chapter, and you think that worked
I think
out?
I think it definitely worked out. I mean,
Okay.
you know, that's what we typically do that, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's fine, but you're in the comfort of your own home. I don't
Yeah,
know.
for sure. So I figure this is better than just like focusing on the questions, because a lot of this stuff will come up later, and you know, the essay they have to write for their midterm, stuff like that. So I just
Well,
wanted
and
this
it
to
also,
be
Yeah, well, and it lets them answer, propose whatever questions they may have about the reading, and I think that's valuable too, so.
Hopefully they'll
Help
be a
them.
little more comfortable in future weeks with actually speaking up and stuff. So we'll see.
Yeah, and they're asking same time next Wednesday.
Yeah, same time next Wednesday.
All right.
I
All right,
forgot
so-
about the messages over here. Were you paying attention to those?
Yeah, there wasn't anything in terms of the chat.
Okay.
The
Oh, yeah.
first question was, as you answered it, you responded to it. I just responded to the second one. So
Okay, cool. Yeah, my other class had this huge chat screen going the whole time and I just completely neglected it the whole time. So if that
Uh-oh.
gets started, just answer questions for me over there.
Definitely, I will. I was paying attention. Definitely.
Cool.
So, okay, you did a
Anything
good
else
job.
for me? All right. Thanks, Jess. Have a good day.
Okay, yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.